Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, just over a year ago we started this show, and our very first guest is indeed my guest today, I'm very pleased to say. Robin Aitken came on to our show to talk about the BBC. He was at the BBC as a reporter over almost the whole spectrum of the BBC for 25 years. And he wrote a book called Can We Trust the BBC? And more recently, The Noble Liar. Now, the BBC is pretty much at the top of our agenda at the moment on the news, so I'm very, very grateful for you coming back. Robin, thank you very much. I wanted to ask, when we spoke before, which was a year ago, we were talking in quite general terms about the BBC, but something seems to have changed, and I wonder, what do you think it is that's actually changed?
Well, I suppose the obvious answer to that is that the general election turned out as it did. And I think that that changed the game completely, politically, as far as the BBC was concerned. The problem for the BBC is that over a period of many years it has made enemies. And the BBC has been oblivious to its critics. They've not engaged with their critics. And consequently, the things which people on the right particularly find objectionable about the BBC have simply got worse. And there's a sort of sense of reckoning now, because I think there are people in government, influential people in government, who believe that the BBC has become in certain ways the enemy. And that's not a healthy place for an organisation like the BBC to find itself.
When you say the enemy, do you mean the enemy of the government, or do you mean actually the enemy of the country?
Well, let's put it this way. The BBC has a large body of support in the country. But the support that it has is fairly cohesive culturally. There is a cultural elite which very much likes what the BBC does and approves of it very strongly. And they are a very influential and powerful group. So they're supporters of the BBC. But on the other side, you've got also a substantial minority of people who feel that the BBC distorts the news in a way which is not to their liking. That people feel the BBC doesn't speak for them, doesn't speak to them, doesn't allow them to speak to us. BBC, is fairly. It has become a bit of a bubble, in a way, a cultural bubble.
You know that at one point, when you talk about the news, it used to always be Tory MPs complaining about a lack of, as it were, balance on the Today programme. But it seems that there has been a greater recognition amongst the general public of general drift, political drift in the BBC, would you say?
Well, I think so. And I think the obvious reason for that, or one of the reasons, is that the Brexit debate, of course, made people hyper-alert to what they were hearing and seeing. So the thing about the Brexit debate was that it divided the country into two camps, and both camps knew what they believed. And people in the Brexit camp, those who were in favour of leaving the EU, found that the BBC did not represent their views. They weren't hearing the voices of people making the argument for Britain to leave the EU in the same way they were hearing repeatedly the argument for the BBC for the country to stay in the EU. There was a huge imbalance. And it wasn't just a question of, this isn't just a question of counting numbers, it's also a question of tone. And I think the BBC gave the impression throughout that debate that it was firmly of the opinion that the country should stay in the EU and that further European integration was a good thing. That was the tone of what they were saying. And because of the imbalance also in the ratio of interviewees, it was inevitable that leavers would feel a sense of chagrin about that. So, that's part of it.
I think when it comes to the way things have changed in people's attitudes to the BBC. It seems to me that it's, as I say, it's not, you mentioned Brexit, but also it is in the kind of the woke, progressive attitudes which increasingly, unless I'm being paranoid, increasingly you see on the BBC.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, Peter. And I mean, so as I said, the Brexit debate was a contributory factor to what we're talking about, which is this sense of alienation that quite a lot of people feel towards the BBC now. So the Brexit debate was one reason for that, but you put your finger on the other, which I think is an equally important factor, and that is the, if you like, the cultural tone of the BBC. So what cultures does the BBC extol? What cultures does it promote? And as you say, it's a very woke culture. And so you get an imbalance, because you get a lot of people campaigning for and talking in favour of certain reforms, cultural reforms, if you like, but these cover the equality agenda, the inclusivity agenda, all these things. Now, individually, there's nothing wrong with a lot of these campaigns, but the problem is that they hog the argument, and that people feel they're being preached at by campaigning groups with which they do not agree, but never have their say. And that's the thing. So you never hear the ordinary man in the streets argument against some of this nonsense which is taught in the woke culture. Things which we all understand and know about, where the common sense view of the man or woman in the street is quite different from that of the cultural elite. That's the problem.
It sort of comes through in things such as dramas and non-news things. I mean, I've jotted down a few things. I remember at Christmas time, for example, I saw a Christmas Carol, which had every issue sort of plugged into it, and elongated as a result. Totally unnecessary. And also, there's been a lot of fuss recently about this horrible histories thing, which is where that was classic stuff, wasn't it? Like,
absolutely.
Sort of basic everything you thought about Britain's not true. It's basically we're terrible.
Absolutely.
There's sort of cultural damage being done by that kind of thing, isn't there?
It's the cultural sneer towards a what one might call mainstream opinion. So most people in the country, or I think, still feel pride in the country, and most people feel patriotic to a certain extent. Now, when the BBC portrays, as it very often does, Britishness, British history, in a negative light, people get their hackles up, because I think it has become, this is something which has become more and more pronounced. That's the problem.
Yes.
So as you rightly say, these politically correct ideas are obtruding into all manner of output, drama output. I mean, Doctor Who is the classic.
Yes.
I don't watch Doctor Who, I might say, but I know that there's been a lot of comment on the way that when the Doctor travels back in time, this anachronistic set of modern woke opinions is projected onto historical situations. I mean, it's laughable, really. It's like a sort of, it really is quite Soviet in its intensity and in its ubiquity. It's as though the BBC simply doesn't understand that it is out of step with a lot of people. I mean, I think partly this is born out of almost a contempt for parts of British culture. There are parts of British culture which the BBC actually does not approve of. And
such as, can you...
Well, there are aspects of working class life which involve things which the cultural elite disapprove of. And so attitudes about gender relationships, about the way that men and women live their lives in a more traditional way than is often portrayed, that the BBC does not reflect and does not celebrate that kind of ordinary lifestyle.
No.
What it celebrates is a transgressive lifestyle where we know what is approved of and we know what is disapproved of. And I think that people are becoming increasingly aware of that fact, that actually the BBC shuts them out of the conversation.
Is it just approval, or would you say that actually also at the basis of it is a form of attack? I mean, without wishing to, get all culturally Marxist all over you here, but it would appear like that actually ultimately the aim is to question to death almost.
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been a swift and now complete takeover of the BBC by people who are culturally liberal.
More than when you were there?
Well, I think the process has gone on since I left, and I still keep in touch with people in the BBC, so I know quite a lot about what goes on one way and another. And there are many people in the BBC, quite senior people, a lot of them, who have misgivings about what's happening. It's difficult for individuals to speak up in the BBC, and it certainly doesn't burnish your career prospects. But there is a problem, and some people recognise it.
There's a report out today, actually, we're recording this, which is all about people who work in the arts generally.
I saw that.
You saw this?
I read it.
Fascinating. It's fascinating. It's nothing we don't know, Robin, really, but to see it in black and white nevertheless.
Absolutely.
And I sort of include in that television, obviously, because these are sort of, if you like, these are arts programs. These are, it's the performing arts, the visual arts, all of them, people employed in those areas. And essentially the report is saying that you just simply can't have a dissenting view.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I thought that was a fascinating report. I read it closely, actually, with close attention, because I just thought how interesting that was, because it confirms much of what you hear anecdotally. And I have an anecdote of my own, actually, which so I recently appeared. I was asked to go on to the BBC for the first time, actually, for a number of years. They asked me on to one of their radio shows, The Moral Maze, and I talked about it. It was about the BBC future of. And so I had my say, and
you were a witness on it, were you?
Yeah, I was just a witness. You get your 7 minutes, so you just get your little input, which is actually not long, actually, and of course you have to be guided by the questions you're asked. So it's not a wholly satisfactory format as far as I was concerned. But anyway, I said my piece, and a day later, I got an email from a very senior producer of a very long-running and high-profile BBC drama series, which has been in with the brickwork, as it were, saying that she would like to be more inclusive in her script writing team, but could find no writers who were prepared to articulate other than the liberal orthodoxy in scripts.
Right.
And she asked me if I'd go and talk to them about...
Really?
Yeah. And interestingly, so this person, and full marks to her, thought that... Because my shtick when I'm asked about the BBC, what I often say is that the BBC talks a lot about diversity. And it talks a lot about diversity in terms of skin colour, sexual orientation, etc., etc., etc. We know the categories. The category that is not included is political. So
diversity of opinion.
Yeah, there's no political diversity within the BBC. And this is conveniently left out of the equation. Although when you think about it, it is vital for the BBC to have political diversity within it. Because lacking that diversity, it finds it very difficult to be objective about issues that matter to us all. And that is where the blind spot is. And the BBC, unfortunately, will not engage with its critics. It has shown, a degree of contempt for public opinion, but it has also shown, very visibly, I think, a contempt for political opinion, particularly that associated with Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw an interview that Laura Kuenssberg did with Boris Johnson during the course of the Brexit campaign. She treated him with contempt. And he was Prime Minister at the time, but there was no sense that this was a man that the office deserves respect.
Yeah.
It's the office, not the man. It was all too obvious from this example and others that there was a contempt for many of the conservatives and conservative ideas, and these were ideas which were, as it was then proved, were popular in the country. The country may not love the Tory party, and one couldn't blame them for that. I find as an object of affection, the Tory party leaves a lot to be desired. But still, they had the pulse of the nation.
Yes.
Didn't they?
Just to go back to, you told us when you were on the Moral Mace, you got this email. Will you go in and talk to the scriptwriters, do you think? She asked you to? Yeah.
Of course.
And
Why
so
not?
she was asking basically how they should maybe include more diversity of opinion in their scripts. Is that what it is?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if I'm particularly well suited to do this job because I'm not a scriptwriter. But what I've been thinking about it, and it seems to me that if you are portraying the lives of so-called ordinary people, the scriptwriter's job is to portray all kinds of lives with all kinds of opinions and all kinds of outcomes. And there is a pattern in BBC drama where that by and large anyone who's portrayed as a Tory will be a baddie of some sort. And there is a sort of distinct animus against the upper class. I'm not upper class, clearly. I'm not upper class. So it's not my class. But I can see that the upper class is always portrayed in a particular way.
It's interesting you mentioned that because they seem to be obsessed as well with the Profumo affair. I just feel that I've seen a hell of a lot. I mean, we've just had this long drama. And I thought, why would this be? And I just thought, well, it's about how rotten the establishment was. I mean, it might well have been at the time, but you sort of think, what is it about this relatively minor piece of history, which is absolutely fascinating to me? I was do you? I mean, you went on Moral Maze, but do you watch much BBC yourself these days?
Not much, no. I don't. I listen to a lot of BBC. And what I do use a lot, actually, the BBC website. I use that as a sort of it has a fairly decent coverage. I mean, I also consume every day 6 or 8 or 10 other news sites because I do it the whole time. And it's an obsessive thing, and it sometimes I regret the fact I spend so much time looking at this stuff, but I do, just to try to get a sense of what is out there. There are many things that, stories that interest me which never appear on the BBC, for instance. But on the other hand, if you go onto their news website, the World section, and you trawl through the various sections, you'll usually find in there, there are countries I'm interested in, like India a bit, and other parts of the world, America particularly. Their American news has to be treated with great circumspection, unfortunately.
Well, yes.
I think the BBC's coverage of Trump And America this past 4 years has been so bad that it astonishes me that it is as partisan as it is. I find it quite startling, really.
I think it's almost there is a strange fascination with the American system and American politics. I think they've got something like 13 reporters or whatever covering the American election, and American politics is covered with a detail which is actually quite extraordinary. I know that America is a very important country, but it is, and it, at the same time there is this horror of Trump, and I think that probably the people who at the BBC obviously don't really meet anyone who might actually have a good word to say about him. Wouldn't you say that's right? What?
I mean, I've never heard anyone say a good word about Trump on the BBC. No. It's like a sort of
unthinkable.
It is. It's funny.
I wonder whether what you think of this one. That during the election, obviously, we had this thing whereby Boris Johnson decided not to go on the Andrew Neil programme, not to be interviewed, and there was a huge kerfuffle. This was terrible for democracy, etc., etc. Of course, it just was entirely forgotten about. It made no difference at all to anybody at the election. And then we had this thing whereby senior ministers were kind of boycotting the Today programme. Not necessarily wanting to make a trend out of this, but it does appear that there is now a more American approach, actually, which is that we're not going to do this media if we're constantly going to be treated in this way.
Absolutely.
Do you think that's a good thing?
Well, before I answer that, actually, something that struck me has been a trend which has quickened in recent years, which is something which in one talks like an old fart when you get to this point, but in my day, right? The idea of inviting a government minister on to the Today programme, sitting him down, asking minister, tell us what government policy is, at the end of which you turn to your political editor who's sitting in the same studio, and you say, well, Laura, what do you make? What is your comment on what the minister has just said? And very often, that would be an oppositional stance. So, as it were, what the BBC did was it invited a government minister in and then sets up a rival authority alongside, who comments on what has just been said, with no right of reply, of course, by the politician sitting there. Now, of course, part of the job of senior BBC journalist is to explain the world to the audience. But the way that was done made it very often seem to me that the BBC was saying, you can't trust this guy, whoever it is, and whatever they've said, and we've got to interpret that for you right here and now with this person sitting next to you. Now, that elevates the status of the journalist to that of pundit, and she or he becomes actually an influential person in their own right. And I think there were times when the BBC did that too often, and very often the comments which came immediately after the minister's interview were very negative and very oppositional. And is that the right thing for the BBC to do? No. And I'm not surprised. In fact, I think it's very smart, actually, because the Today programme, with the input of government ministers stripped out, is definitely hollowed out to a certain extent. And you will know this if you've, I'm sure you do, that one of the things which current affairs shows like Today care about is what we call pickup. Has this story been picked up? Now, there was a time when, because of its status and its position as the BBC's most important current affairs show, that someone appearing on the 8:10 slot there would very often be picked up by the daily papers, by everyone else. It sets the agenda for the day, and often carries on into the next day. And so those sorts of interviews are really the raison d'etre of such a programme. These are the interviews the programme wants to do. The programme wants to have the environment minister on, and you need that to talk about, the green agenda and all that. Stripped of that, it makes the Today programme much less necessary listening, I'm afraid. And I've certainly, although it's not because I have any loyalty to the Today programme especially, although I loved working there. I worked under Rod Liddell.
Oh, wow.
Who was the
esteemed
editor.
guest of this show.
And, so those were great days, and I loved working actually for Today. It was a great show to work for. But they have brought this on themselves, not Today alone, but the BBC generally has got up the nose of the wrong people, because those people, very unluckily for it, have now arrived in government. And, there is, I think, the whiff of comeuppance in the air.
I think we start off by saying that there is something about the current sort of discussion, particularly about the licence fee, which feels more serious than whatever that I can remember it. I mean, it is now a discussion, it's on the agenda, and there is an assumption behind. It seems actually there's growing consensus this just simply cannot go on. Would you say? I mean, or am I being too optimistic about that?
I think there are two things to say about the licence fee. One is that it is failing a technical test in the sense of, is this a justifiable tax as it once was, given that there are some, and a growing number of people apparently, who don't use the service, right? So that's the sort of technical aspect of it. But there's another point, and this actually means that in my view very little is going to happen about this, at least in the near future, is that people talk about it as, okay, if you get rid of the licence fee, what comes next? And people are talking about a subscription model. The problem with that is a technical problem also, which is that BBC services are not currently set up, and the technology does not exist to make the BBC into a subscription service.
Right.
And also what you would have to do, I mean, one of the things that would have to happen is that everyone would have to have new kit in their homes, or the pensioners would have to have new kit in their homes, right? This is not a small undertaking, and so you can't simply change the BBC into a subscription model, so that's one thing. On the other hand, you're right, it is now on the agenda, and because of the first thing I mentioned, the fact that there is a growing number of people who don't use the service and yet still have to pay, and it's the equity of that, I suppose, which is driving that particular argument. And you've got to make a political decision about that in conjunction with the BBC about what can be done about that, because it is a problem.
What would you do, actually, Robin? I mean, what would you like to see? Would you like to see the licence fee gone entirely? Would you, or some people want a bit of it kept, don't they?
I mean, I constantly talk with friends and other journalists about this sort of thing, and some of my friends. One man I'm thinking of in particular, a senior commentator in the newspapers, he has lost patience with the BBC. He now thinks that the BBC cannot be reformed, and therefore it's outlived its usefulness as a concept. And I have always argued for reform of the BBC. It's a bit like being in it. It's a bit like those people who were sceptical of the EU but wanted to reform it but not leave it. It's that sort of stance I've taken. But I'm not sure whether that is tenable. If the BBC, it feels as if we're at some sort of critical point for the BBC.
Isn't this also because in 7 years' time, the charter comes up for renewal, so it's like that's a kind of decent time, isn't it, if you like, for this to take root, or a different approach to take root.
Yes. That's right.
I wonder what the BBC internally, can you speculate what their attitude will be to what's happening at the moment? I mean, this isn't just an obsession of the likes of you and me and think tanks and what have you, and all the rest. It is actually sort of right out there,
Yeah.
and it is being discussed. Will they be circling the wagons, or will they start to get aggressively defensive? Will they start to put out their stall, or what? I've heard things like Steve Coogan saying, "I'll be first at the barricades," and defending the BBC.
Well, I mean, it's been interesting seeing what has been said. I mean, the BBC has taken quite a firm stance that it doesn't want to see the licence fee system ended. So it's very pro maintaining the current. Yes. The status quo is what it generally likes, and it's worried about the ending of any criminal sanction, legal sanction rather, for non-payment of the licence. So, if that is decriminalised, then that would have an impact too. So these are things that the BBC is against and which worry it. In the more general sense of what the higher echelons of the BBC think about the current situation, well, my speculation would be worth no more than anyone else's, because I don't move in those circles. But I think that there will be some in the higher reaches of the corporation who are thinking seriously about the current situation. And if they've any sense, they'll be trying to formulate some sort of truce between the organisation and the BBC. It's essential for the BBC. If the BBC wants to maintain the status quo, which I believe it does, maintaining the status quo is going to mean reaching an accommodation with the government. And this means defanging the government's critics. So how do you do that? Well, there has to be, we are waiting for some white smoke from the top of the Vatican. That we want to. I was asked one of these stupid, one of these irritating kind of runners and riders thing for a news outlet. So I was asked to do one, and so that appointment, the successor to Tony Hall, will be an important appointment, not just in terms of the talents and inclinations of the person who gets it, but as a visible sign that the BBC is prepared to treat with the government.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see any at the moment. I think probably the BBC, it must still be working out what it's about. I mean, we are in a new situation here. These are uncharted waters for the BBC, and they have to tread carefully to make sure that the response they eventually do come up with is going to be a good defensive posture.
I think you say that uncharted waters, but I think it was the chairman recently, talking in defence of the BBC, and he said, the thing I've heard time immemorial, the BBC brings the country together. And he used as the example Gavin and Stacey doing very well at Christmas, the sitcom, and royal weddings, jubilees, sports event. But the truth is if you take that apart, there was a rather careworn feel actually about that. Gavin and Stacey got something like 11 million, which is good in this day and age, but it's not 30 million like it used to, and there are all sorts of reasons for that. And
absolutely.
Also, does it actually bring the country together anymore? I mean, when it did the Jubilee, it made an absolute mess of it.
Absolutely.
So.
Well, you see, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the tone of the BBC. I don't think the BBC understands any longer how to get on the nation's wavelength.
Yes.
It really doesn't. It doesn't have the pulse of the country. And it's not only in its news and current affairs output, it's also in its drama output. It's in every aspect of the output. The BBC too often finds itself, you know, I mean, sometimes it seems to me, not, but certainly during the most sort of tensest and most agonising parts of the Brexit debate, BBC sometimes sounded to me as if I tuned in. It was as if I was listening to a foreign broadcaster. There was so little. There was so little identification with the country.
Yes.
So it was as if you know what the Continentals, whatever Barnier or any of them, you know, that weary list of characters that we've all now shunted to the back of our minds, hopefully forever. All those names that were the daily stuff of the Today Show, you know, and the way in which all too often it seemed as if the implicit attitude of the programme and the interviewers was that the EU was in the right, and whatever we were saying was either laughably implausible or wrong or stupid, you know. So it felt very much, you know, at times to me as if I was listening to. You know, there was just a palpable hostility.
Yes, too much of a distance is what you're saying. Too much of a distance.
Yes, exactly, because you know what the BBC always proclaims about its news is that it achieves objectivity, and that is a difficult concept to define in terms of journalism, and it's also an even more difficult quality to master and employ. The truly objective journalists, I think, are very few and far between. They are masters of their trade. I'm not one of them, but there are many men and women I've known over the years who have striven to be objective, and some of them have attained that. And these are largely BBC people, but not just BBC people. Other people in other aspects, you know, other newspapers and so on. People who've really striven for a sort of clear-sighted and honest view of British affairs. It's difficult. It's difficult because you know, none of us we all carry with us these, you know, our carrier bag of opinions and prejudices and views, don't we?
Yes.
And you know, I do. I know. And so, if you ask me, could I be objective about Irish nationalism, for instance, I would say no, I couldn't.
No, I completely see that, but that was something that they majored on for a long time at BBC, and I think that it's, particularly with the advent of social media, people sounding off on Twitter, you know, reporters, this is another thing, isn't it? That I think finally, I think what maybe is a bit of a watershed at the moment, you refer to it there, is the decriminalisation of the licence fee. This will be the sort of the real thin end of the wedge. If there is that feeling about it.
I think so.
And it almost, I would have thought that will happen, actually, won't it?
Well, I don't know if it will or not. I think that it. I can see it happening. I think it's conceivable that it will happen, and it's something that you rightly say. I mean, it's something that could be. The thing is that, of course, it can be justified. That's the point. So you can make a case for decriminalising it, and it's a plausible case, especially as that particular thing bears hardest on that sector of the population which is very often the least able to pay.
Yes.
You know. So what you're doing is you're taking poor people through a legal process to screw 150 quid out of them on the BBC's part. And you know, that there is a sort of basic inequity about that in a way. I mean, it's the poor which always, but you know, it's the poor who always get the dirty end of the stick, and it's in that sense, it's of course the BBC then. It is a difficult argument for it because it will know this as well, that actually, you know, what I've just said, that a lot of people who do get taken to court are those who are the poorest. And I don't think that'll sit easily with the BBC itself, probably, because there are a lot of good hearted people in it who will think that's wrong. So, I think you're right, actually. That could easily happen. I don't know if it will. And I think probably, you might be right. Actually, it could well happen.
But put it this way, the issue is not going away this time,
exactly.
is it? It's not going away.
It's live, and it's out there.
Well, while it's not going away, that means you're going to be on here quite a few times, Robin, actually, just as a forewarning, because your perspective is just it's so invaluable to us. Thanks very much for coming back this time.
Oh.
And I reckon that maybe this time next year, if not before, there might have been some big movement on this, who knows. But, thank you. Thank you very much for watching. Do subscribe to us, won't you, please? And I will see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye.